At what point in your life did you realize that what you were tolerating no longer hurt sharply enough to provoke resistance, yet quietly drained you every day until even standing upright felt heavier than it should? This realization does not arrive with clarity or resolve, but with a dull and persistent fatigue that cannot be traced to effort alone. You begin to notice that certain situations require a disproportionate expenditure of energy simply to endure them, that after leaving them your body slumps slightly forward, your chest feels quieter but heavier, and your movement slows as if something essential has been siphoned away. The psyche does not protest loudly at first. It allows endurance. It observes. But tolerance has a natural limit, and when that limit is crossed repeatedly, fatigue becomes the language of refusal. Most people misread this fatigue as weakness, and respond by increasing effort, extending patience, or doubling commitment, believing that endurance is proof of character. Yet endurance becomes corrosive when it is no longer chosen. When vitality is spent maintaining what offers no return, the psyche begins to withdraw its cooperation. Ordinary obligations start to feel oppressive, not because they are difficult, but because they are no longer psychologically justified. One continues out of habit and guilt, mistaking obligation for necessity. The cost appears first as heaviness, not conflict. Carl Jung observed that the psyche does not remove what is merely unpleasant, but what has become structurally incompatible with its survival. When guilt is the only force sustaining an obligation, energy begins to leak steadily and without drama. The individual may appear reliable, even admirable, yet feels inexplicably depleted. This depletion is not the result of doing too much, but of doing what no longer belongs. Guilt preserves appearances, while vitality dissolves underneath. The body keeps the account. There is a particular danger in mistaking endurance for virtue. Endurance has value only when it serves something alive. When endurance becomes automatic, when it is maintained to avoid disappointing others or disrupting familiar arrangements, it transforms into self-erasure. The psyche tolerates this erasure temporarily, but it cannot sustain it indefinitely. Fatigue deepens, motivation collapses. The individual begins to feel as though life is being lived at a distance. This distance is not emotional, it is energetic. Carl Jung understood that overtolerance produces a peculiar numbness that often masquerades as stability. One stops reacting not because one is mature, but because reaction has become too costly. The body adapts by reducing responsiveness. Shoulders sink, breathing becomes shallow. The posture of endurance replaces the posture of engagement. This adaptation allows continuation, but at the expense of vitality. What is endured without necessity eventually demands removal. The psyche initiates this process quietly. There is an early point at which this elimination could complete itself cleanly, yet most individuals never allow it to reach its conclusion. They interrupt it with justification, with loyalty to outdated roles, with the belief that perseverance alone will restore meaning. As a result, they remain diluted for life, functioning adequately while feeling perpetually tired, never fully present. This is not tragedy, it is consequence. The psyche does not argue with such choices, it simply adjusts energy downward. The earliest sign that elimination has begun is not anger or rebellion, but relief at the thought of reduction. One imagines no longer carrying certain responsibilities and feels a subtle loosening in the chest. This sensation is quickly suppressed by guilt, yet it reveals the psyche's direction. What drains vitality, what persists only through guilt, what demands endurance without return, has already been marked internally. The body knows before the mind permits acknowledgement. Fatigue precedes decision. Carl Jung did not frame this process as moral correction, but as psychological hygiene. When coherence is threatened, the psyche removes what compromises it. This removal is not negotiable and cannot be explained without weakening its effect. It begins as withdrawal of energy and ends as cessation of tolerance. Those who resist remain tired. Those who allow it regain gravity. The difference is precise. Energy responds to legitimacy, not obligation. The psyche withdraws energy from what is endured without necessity. After prolonged overtolerance, the psyche begins removing what exists only through performance. Relationships that require a constant display of agreeableness, competence, or emotional availability start to feel strangely hollow. One notices that connection depends on remaining legible, predictable, and useful. When attention drifts or sincerity replaces presentation, tension enters the room. The body responds immediately. The neck tightens, breathing shallows. Energy leaks away in conversation itself. What was once called connection is revealed as maintenance. This fatigue is distinct from social exhaustion. It arises not from interaction but from impersonation. When a relationship survives only because a role is performed correctly, the psyche registers it as false attachment. Such attachments persist because they provide familiarity and validation, yet they prevent seriousness from forming. One senses that nothing essential can happen there. Afterward, there is no nourishment, only depletion. The psyche begins to reduce its investment quietly. Invitations feel heavier. Responses delay. Withdrawal begins without announcement. Carl Jung recognized that when persona overtakes presence, energy is misallocated. The persona exists to mediate between the individual and society, but when it becomes the primary mode of relationship, the psyche suffocates beneath it. Performative bonds demand continual adjustment and explanation. They do not tolerate silence or change. Over time, the individual feels compelled to justify moods, choices, and limits to preserve connection. This compulsion signals a deeper error. Energy is being spent to remain acceptable rather than real. At a certain point, the need to explain oneself becomes reflexive. One speaks preemptively, offering reasons before being asked, clarifying intentions that were never questioned, softening truth to avoid disturbance. Each explanation drains a small amount of energy. The body notices first. The jaw tightens. The chest grows restless. There is a subtle urgency to be understood that never resolves. Explanation replaces presence. Connection becomes conditional upon interpretation. Where in your life are you maintaining connection primarily through explanation rather than through shared reality? Carl Jung understood that compulsive explanation is not communication but defense. It arises when inner authority has been surrendered and must be replaced with justification. When one no longer trusts the legitimacy of their own position, they attempt to secure it through words. Yet explanation invites scrutiny. Scrutiny demands further explanation. The cycle accelerates. Energy disperses. Seriousness cannot form where everything must be accounted for. Silence becomes impossible. The psyche responds by withdrawing. As explanation increases, identity begins to fragment. One adapts speech, posture, and values depending on audience. Roles multiply. The individual becomes efficient at occupying them, yet uncertain where they end. Borrowed identities feel lighter at first because they relieve responsibility, but they exact a cumulative cost. The body carries this cost as fatigue. Shoulders round, movement loses decisiveness. The psyche resists investing further in what lacks inner coherence. Carl Jung observed that roles adopted without inner assent eventually collapse under their own weight. They require constant reinforcement from external recognition. When recognition falters, anxiety rises. The individual works harder to maintain alignment with expectations that no longer correspond to inner necessity. Energy is consumed by calibration rather than creation. The psyche begins to dismantle these borrowed structures by removing the energy that sustains them. Confusion precedes clarity. Withdrawal precedes orientation. As performative relationships thin out, explanation loses urgency, and roles dissolve, a new gravity emerges. It is not confidence but density. The body feels steadier. The chest quiets. Fewer words are needed. Connection becomes rarer, but more substantial. This reduction is often experienced as loss, yet the psyche registers it as consolidation. Energy no longer disperses to maintain appearances. It gathers. Seriousness becomes possible again. The individual stands with less effort. This elimination is irreversible once completed. Performative bonds cannot be revived without reinstating the persona. Explanation cannot be abandoned selectively. Borrowed identities do not survive seriousness. The psyche does not remove these elements out of cruelty, but necessity. Where energy is wasted on performance, it cannot support development. Removal restores concentration. Gravity returns only after impersonation ends. Seriousness forms only after performance. Explanation and borrowed identity are withdrawn. As inner consolidation begins, the psyche turns away from exposure. What once felt necessary to share now feels premature. Words hesitate before leaving the mouth. The impulse to explain inner movements to others weakens. This is not secrecy born of fear, but a recognition that correction cannot survive visibility. When inner change is spoken too early, it fragments. The body senses this risk and responds by quieting urgency. The chest steadies. The need to be received dissolves. Withdrawal becomes protective rather than defensive. Many experience this phase as sudden isolation. Familiar channels close. Conversations lose momentum. The individual senses that being understood is no longer essential to survival. This realization feels disorienting because the need to be understood once functioned as reassurance. Yet understanding, when sought prematurely, disperses energy outward before it has reorganized inward. The psyche therefore removes the demand for recognition. It does not argue, it simply ceases to offer material for interpretation. Silence becomes containment. Carl Jung observed that inner correction requires concealment. Not concealment from others, but from premature interpretation. The unconscious does not tolerate interference while it reorganizes. When inner decisions are exposed too early, they become subject to external reaction and internal doubt. Energy is redirected toward managing responses rather than completing correction. The psyche therefore withdraws the impulse to be understood. This withdrawal feels final. One stops seeking resonance and begins to value coherence. Alongside this withdrawal comes a resistance to permission. Where one once sought approval before acting, a quiet refusal emerges. Decisions no longer present themselves for discussion. The individual senses that asking permission weakens resolve. Permission invites negotiation. Negotiation delays action. The psyche responds by sealing intent before it becomes language. This sealing is somatic. The body firms, posture steadies, action feels inevitable rather than debated. Confession often disguises itself as honesty at this stage. One feels compelled to reveal inner movements as proof of integrity. Yet confession, when driven by anxiety, functions as dispersal. It hands unfinished correction to others for evaluation. The psyche recognizes this danger and withdraws the impulse. Words stop short. Disclosure feels invasive. What remains unspoken grows stronger. Correction requires privacy. Exposure weakens it. Where do you still feel compelled to justify an inner decision before it has taken form? Carl Jung understood that justification is not explanation but defense against doubt. When inner authority is intact, justification becomes unnecessary. The urge to justify signals that correction is incomplete. The psyche therefore reduces visibility to protect the process. This reduction is experienced as withdrawal from dialogue, not hostility. The individual becomes less available for interpretation. Silence regains legitimacy. Energy consolidates. As visibility decreases, a new seriousness appears. It is not intensity, but gravity. The body moves with less nervous urgency. The chest quiets. Breathing deepens without effort. This seriousness does not seek validation. It does not explain itself. Others may perceive it as distance, yet it functions as containment. The psyche is no longer negotiating its direction. It is completing it. Exposure would fracture this completion. Carl Jung emphasized that inner correction cannot be communal until it is complete. Premature sharing destabilizes what is still forming. The psyche therefore eliminates the need to be understood, the habit of seeking permission and confession used to relieve anxiety. These removals are not moral judgments. They are structural necessities. Energy cannot reorganize while it is constantly externalized. Withdrawal restores coherence. When this phase concludes, the individual finds that much has resolved without discussion. Decisions feel settled. Explanations feel unnecessary. Silence no longer feels empty. It feels sufficient. The psyche has completed its correction without interference. Visibility can return later, but only after solidity has been established. Until then, withdrawal is law. Inner correction fails when it is exposed before it is complete. As inner correction consolidates, the psyche begins to recover weight by reducing reach. What once felt expansive now feels thin. The tension scattered across too many directions produces a peculiar lightness that is not freedom but loss of gravity. One senses it in the body as a faint instability, a subtle sway when standing, a difficulty remaining present in any single task. Energy spreads outward without gathering, nothing deepens. The psyche registers this dispersion as danger and begins to contract the field of engagement. This contraction is often mistaken for limitation, yet it restores density. Multidirectional commitments, once tolerated as productivity or generosity, reveal their cost through exhaustion without accomplishment. Each direction claims a portion of energy, yet none receives enough to mature. The body mirrors this dilution. The chest feels busy but empty. Breathing becomes quick and shallow. The psyche responds by withdrawing investment from simultaneous demands. Fewer directions remain. Weight returns. Carl Jung understood that gravity is essential for psychic development. Without concentration, energy cannot penetrate experience deeply enough to transform it. When commitments multiply beyond capacity, the psyche loses seriousness. Everything becomes provisional. Nothing is carried to completion. The individual remains active but unfocused. Over time, this produces fatigue indistinguishable from boredom. The psyche corrects by eliminating excess reach. What cannot be held fully is released. Alongside this reduction, emotional availability undergoes a quiet recalibration. One notices that offering presence without receiving it in return produces a steady drain. Listening without being heard, supporting without support, remaining open where reciprocity is absent slowly erodes vitality. The body responds first. Shoulders tighten, the chest grows guarded, fatigue appears after interaction rather than effort. The psyche marks these asymmetries and begins to close channels that function as one-way passages. Carl Jung observed that emotional availability without reciprocity dissolves inner boundaries. When one remains open indefinitely, the psyche loses containment. Energy leaks through unreturned investment. Compassion becomes compulsion. The individual confuses openness with virtue and ignores the cost. Eventually, the psyche intervenes by reducing accessibility. Availability narrows. Silence replaces response. This is not withdrawal from relationship, but restoration of symmetry. Energy requires exchange to remain alive. Where does your energy disperse before it has time to gather weight? Constant responsiveness undergoes a similar correction. Immediate replies, perpetual readiness, and the habit of being reachable at all times prevent depth from forming. The psyche cannot descend while it is continually summoned to the surface. The body registers this interruption as nervous urgency. The chest tightens, muscles remain primed, rest becomes shallow. Over time, the psyche withdraws responsiveness to protect continuity. Delays appear, replies slow, presence deepens elsewhere. Carl Jung recognized that responsiveness without hierarchy flattens experience. When everything demands equal attention, nothing matters enough to warrant full investment. The psyche restores hierarchy by refusing immediacy. What is essential remains. What is peripheral waits. This waiting is not neglect but filtration. Energy gathers where it is permitted to remain uninterrupted. Gravity returns through exclusion. Depth requires insulation. As reach narrows, availability recalibrates, and responsiveness slows, the individual often experiences a sudden steadiness. The body feels heavier but more grounded. Posture stabilizes. The chest quiets. There is less urgency to attend everywhere. Attention becomes selective. This selectivity is not indifference. It is concentration. The psyche has restored weight by reducing dispersion. Energy no longer leaks across surfaces. It accumulates. Carl Jung emphasized that gravity is the condition for meaning. Without it, life becomes busy but insubstantial. The psyche therefore eliminates excessive direction, asymmetrical availability, and constant responsiveness to restore density. These removals are not losses but consolidations. What remains carries weight. What is released was preventing seriousness. Energy returns where it can descend fully. Depth becomes possible again. Gravity returns. When energy is no longer dispersed across too many directions, when the psyche has completed its reduction, it enters a phase that cannot be undone. What has been removed cannot be reintroduced without immediate consequence. The individual senses this finality not as fear but as firmness. There is a quiet refusal to reopen what has already been resolved. The body registers this refusal through steadiness. Movement becomes economical. The chest remains settled. Energy no longer fluctuates in response to old invitations. Something has closed, and it will not reopen without damage. At this stage, a peculiar temptation appears. The mind suggests compromise. It offers diluted versions of what was eliminated, softened arrangements that promise familiarity without cost. These proposals feel reasonable, even mature, yet the psyche rejects them instantly. Negotiation weakens correction. Returning in reduced form reintroduces dispersion. The body responds to these temptations with immediate fatigue, a subtle heaviness that signals violation. The psyche does not argue.